What the? What is that? Wait. What's going on, guys? Jazz here and welcome to the video. So today I thought I would go through my approach to abdominal x-rays, whether or not you end up having to look at one in one of your after hours shifts or while you're in ED. It's a very common study that's performed, so I thought I'd try and give a few tips today to make your assessment of this type of study a lot easier. So first things first, we want to know what kind of projection this is. Is it supine, is it erect, or have you been lucky enough to get both? Most commonly, or the most common way of knowing, it will usually be documented. The radiographers will usually put a stamp on the study, so in this case it's supine. So we've had a look at what kind of projection it is, supine or erect, and then we kind of move on to the bowel loops. So the first organ to look at is the bowel, and it's usually the reason the study has been performed. The clinical question generally will be query bowel obstruction. Every now and again it might be query, severe constipation, or assess for fecal loading or something along that line as well. So having a look at the bowel loops. So as we know from anatomy, the small bowel generally will be more central, and we have the colon that usually runs along the periphery. So having a look, we want to look for any abnormal dilatation of any of these bowel loops, which could suggest either a small or large bowel obstruction. So in this study, there's we can see some of these colon loops along the periphery containing gas. They don't appear to be abnormally dilated. And measurement wise, usually for colon, if it's greater than about 6 centimeters, it'd be abnormally dilated. All of these appear to be less than that. And for small bowel, you'd be considering about 3 centimeters at the upper limits of normal. So as we can see on this study, there's actually just a relative paucity of gas within the central part of the abdomen, and I don't see any abnormally dilated small bowel loops, which is good. So in the clinical question of whether or not there is a small bowel obstruction, you've got a point of obstruction, and obviously more proximal to that point you'll have dilated loops of bowel. So what you'd be looking for, and this is where an erect study can become useful because of that point of obstruction, you've got fluids and other secretions that are kind of building up more proximally to it, and then when the patient stands up you should get nice air fluid levels, which is the key thing to look for when you're concerned for a small bowel obstruction. So you've had a look at the small and large bowel loops. None of these appear to be abnormally dilated, so that's good. You'll always see some fecal residue throughout the colon, as we can see along the ascending colon, descending colon, and then usually the rectum or rectosigmoid, which is within the pelvis, and you'll usually see some stuff there as well, which is normal. So we've had a look at all the bowel loops, they all look fine, so that's the first kind of organ to assess within the abdomen, so that looks good. Then you kind of want to move on to any of the other soft tissue shadows that you can appreciate. Now anatomy wise, we know right upper quadrant we've got the liver, so you can see the hepatic shadow there as well, and the inferior margin extending to there. And a lot of the times you can tell whether or not the liver is enlarged or not by assessing this shadow. So this comes up to the flank region, so I think that's probably normal. Sometimes you might see the liver in hepatomegaly and it will kind of extend all the way down to here. Again, whether that's a pathological hepatomegaly or that relates to some sort of anatomical variant like Riedel's lobe, then it's difficult to ascertain, but you should be able to tell whether or not the liver is enlarged. Same applies for the spleen, which lives within the left upper quadrant, so you're assessing that splenic shadow as well. And you can, most of the time, if it's grossly abnormal, there's significant splenomegaly, then again you'd be able to appreciate a soft tissue shadow that's kind of projecting towards the flank region or even lower, and then you kind of think of your differentials for splenomegaly. And then the other shadows you kind of want to assess will be the renal shadows, which you can usually appreciate within the flank regions bilaterally. Again, you can see whether or not they look abnormally enlarged. The other main thing you'd kind of want to look for is any radiodense calculus that you can see. So you'd be looking for those over the areas of the renal shadows, and if you see any small kind of calcific foci, it could reflect renal calculi. And then you also follow down the expected path of the ureters as well, which will kind of extend towards the pelvis, and then you can always make out the bladder shadow as well. And sometimes you can pick up small calculi in the distal ureters or within the actual bladder itself. Now you've had a look, so the renal tract, spleen and liver, so they're the main organs that you've kind of assessed in this next part of the study. Also, the other thing to keep in mind is it's very common to see kind of small calcifications that you can pick up within the actual pelvis itself. So if you do see those, then I guess there's only really three main things that you need to consider. Whether they're small little phlebolyths, that's always a possibility. They'll usually be a bit more peripheral, as they're usually vascular in origin. Alternatively, if you've got a calcified focus projecting over the bladder shadow, then it could reflect a bladder calculus. Or in a female patient within the pelvis, it could also reflect an involuted fibroid as well, which usually calcify with age. So those being the three main things to consider with calcifications within the pelvis itself. The other thing you'd want to think about in the pelvis as well in a female patient is an intrauterine contraceptive device. Sometimes you'll see those, and X-rays are usually very useful in assessing for dislodgement of those devices. So sometimes on ultrasound it can be a bit harder to work out, or whether the patient said that they do have a contraceptive device, you do an ultrasound, you don't see anything, and then you're like, well, has it fallen out or has it actually gone out of the uterus into the pelvis? So then a radiograph is always a very easy and useful tool in assessing in that clinical indication. So now we've looked at all the bowel loops, we've looked at all the the main organs that we're concerned about or can assess on the X-ray. Then you kind of move on to the bones. So as we can see, we've got the lumbar spine, sacrum, pelvis, femoral heads, and some of these ribs. So first things first, you want to have a look to make sure there's no bone lesions. So are there any actual bone lesions per se, or is there any pathological fracture? You can see the vertebral body heights along the lumbar spine nicely on this frontal projection. They look nice and even, no collapse to suggest a fracture. The ribs look nice, and then again looking at the pelvis, any bone lesions, the SI joints as well, just to make sure they're not widened, or if there's any signs of sacroiliitis as well, which can be picked up nicely on the X-ray. And then we can also have a look to see if there's any significant degenerative change in the hip joints on either side. So they're the main things that you want to look for on the bones. And then lastly, depending on the field of view, sometimes you'll get a part of the lung bases also imaged. This one we've only got this left costophrenic angle that we can see. You want to assess those to see if there's any pleural effusion, is there any basal consolidation, or is there maybe even a little mass that you can see. It's all very important to assess those. And then the other thing is we want to look for any obvious free gas that we can see as well. So on a supine study, usually obviously the patient's lying on their back, so the gas will kind of pull towards, more anteriorly, and what you'll get is more so just a lucency that kind of is a bit more widespread, usually centrally, and that's something that which raises the possibility of free air. Or you also look for what's called Wriggler's sign, and that will be the bowel projecting on both sides of the bowel wall. So you have the gas on the inside, but because of the free gas on the outside, you'll have the wall of the bowel will become very apparent, and that raises the possibility of free gas. If you've got an erect study, then that's a bit easier, as the gas will kind of float to the top, and then you'd be wanting to look under the diaphragms to see if there's any subdiaphragmatic free air. So we've had a look at all of those things. So we looked for free gas. And then the other thing you want to also look for is any gas along either the biliary tree or within the portal veins. So that's something you definitely don't want to miss. Particularly if you're worried about ischemic bowel, then that can be associated with portal venous gas. And in that instance, you're looking for branching lucencies that generally extend towards the periphery as the gas is within the venous structures there. Alternatively, if you've got gas more centrally at the porta hepatis region, then you'd also be considering pneumobilia. Whether that relates to an intervention such as ERCP, then you'd correlate clinically. But it can also be seen in the instance of fistula formation between bowel and the biliary tree. So that's something also to consider, much less common, but obviously it's something that you do not want to miss. So guys, that's my approach to an abdominal x-ray. I hope you found this video to be useful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if there are any questions or there are any other types of videos like this you would like to see, let me know in the comments below. Thanks guys.